Hello, and welcome to another episode of A Conversation with Carl. Please like, follow, and subscribe for the latest content. Today, I am excited to welcome Gary Bembridge. Gary is a prominent cruise and travel blogger, author, and creator of Tips for the Travelers, one of the largest cruise-focused content platforms with over 300,000 YouTube subscribers. Based in London and originating from Zimbabwe, he transitioned from a career in global marketing to a full-time travel content creator in 2012. Welcome, Gary Bembridge, to the conversation.
Great. Thanks for having me, Carl.
Thank you for doing this. So since you focus heavily on cruising, let's start there. Do you know how many cruises you've been on?
Yes, I've been on 129.
And where's your favorite place to cruise?
I mean, my favorite is always Antarctica, which is just phenomenal. You know, expedition cruise to Antarctica. That is my kind of number one. It's the most incredible place. It's unbelievable. So that's definitely my favorite.
I heard when you go down there, the waters are very choppy.
Yeah. So most cruises will go out of Ushuaia or Port Williams and you have to cross Drake Passage. So Drake Passage is one of the potentially roughest seas in the world because it's actually very narrow space between kind of Antarctica and the landmass of South America. And there's this big Antarctic, movement of water that kind of goes, keeps swooping around. So it kind of it's forced through this narrow space, quite shallow, and so it can be quite choppy. So they always talk about Drake Shake or Drake Lake. So you never know what you're going to get, basically.
Do you get nauseous or you don't get really seasick?
No, I'm very fortunate to touch with it. I've never been seasick, and I've been on rough things in the winter across the transatlantic and so on, but I don't get seasick, no.
Cruising seems to be something people either like or they dislike. They're never in between. Why is that, and why do you love cruising?
I think, in reality, what I always say is if people get on the right cruise line, they will like cruising. The biggest reason that people don't like cruising is they get on the wrong cruise line. So that's what I generally find. If I ever talk to people who said, I didn't enjoy the cruise, you normally find out they've gone on the wrong cruise line because people sort of tend to think of a cruise as a cruise, but actually there's a cruise for everybody, from small ships to big ships to medium ships to packed destinations to quiet destinations to party to enrichment or whatever. So what I like about cruising is, and the reason I'm probably quite addicted to it is it's incredible. In some ways, it's a very easy way to travel, but you can also see a lot in a concentrated period of time. So, you get on board, you unpack once, and then you basically moving. And all of your moving time is efficient because you're staying in the same place, the ship is moving, you're not having to, drive somewhere, wait at an airport. So it's quite actually efficient. And when you're sailing, you're being entertained, you're dining, you're eating, you're listening to lectures, learning stuff, whatever. So I really like that you can just do so much. You can go on a week-long cruise in the Mediterranean and visit, 4 or 5 iconic cities in 1 week, which you could never do land-based. And also I like it because there are some places which you can only really see by cruising, or it's very efficient to see by cruising. Antarctica's one kind of obvious one, but even places like going to Iceland, a cruise is quite efficient because all the key places to see are sort of on the coast. So you can actually see a huge amount of Iceland. Iceland's a very expensive place to visit and it ends up being more cost effective. So it's a combination of things really, but mostly I find people who don't like cruising is they've gone with the wrong cruise line.
So let's talk about the larger cruise lines like Royal Caribbean, Norwegian, and Celebrity. What are the main differences between their ships? Because as you just said, there's larger ships and smaller ships. Like, what are you looking for in a ship if I came to you and I said, I want to go cruising, what would you tell me?
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, I'd probably spend time understanding what you really liked is the key thing. But to just answer the first part, because it'll sort of answer it, is there are, broadly speaking, 4 main categories of cruise. If we exclude expedition stuff at the moment, like mainstream cruising to the Caribbean, Alaska, whatever. So the biggest category by far is the sort of the mass market resort category. So in there you've got Carnival, Norwegian, Royal Caribbean, MSC cruises. These generally speaking are the big, as the name would suggest, resort ships. So there's thousands of people, there's everything on board. Production shows, ice skating rinks, wall climbing, dozens of restaurants. So that's kind of really for people who are looking for a resort experience. So they're very good for families, younger people. You've got or multi-generational stuff, and they are the most affordable. But although they do also have some of the most expensive cabins of all, but you can do this pretty inexpensively. The next category is the premium category, which is lines like Celebrity, Holland America, Princess, Cunard, Virgin Voyages, Disney's in there as well. So a little bit more expensive. They used to traditionally be more for couples, a little bit older. So you'll often find it'll skew older, people will be maybe 60s, late 50s, 60s and older. And on there, and they will tend to also do more interesting destinations. So the first category will tend to really just do the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and some stuff in Alaska. Premium will do all those as well, but they'll also do Asia, Africa, Australia. So they'll have slightly more interesting itineraries. They'll have longer sailings, they'll do world cruises. They tend to be a little bit more sedate, if you like. Then you have the next category, which is the small ship luxury category, Viking, Windstar, Azamara, other sort of lines in there. So these tend to be much smaller ships, so much less stuff on board, and then a little bit more focus on the destinations. So you're not going to have as much happening on board, as much choice on board, and they're going to be more all-inclusive. Then you have the ultra-luxury, which is things like Seabourn, Explorer Journeys, Bristol, Regent Seven Seas, and that's for people who have a lot of budget. They want to do lots of comfort in very small ships, and again, are looking for kind of more unusual destinations. They've probably done the Caribbean, their kids have grown up, and they're now looking for more interesting stuff. So one of the key things is asking people like, but what experience do you want? Because you can go to most of these places in the world with any experience you want. So if you're a real party animal, there's certain lines that are better for you. If you're the sort of person who wants to have loads of dining choices, is another experience. So it's really around understanding that, and also what sort of people you want to be with. So if you don't want any kids guaranteed, there are a handful of adult-only lines, for example.
Have you been on all four of them?
I've been on most cruise lines. I mean, there's some smaller regional ones I haven't been on, but I've been on pretty much every cruise line.
And what do you like the best, or what are you looking for?
Well, it's interesting because I often get asked, like, what's my favorite line and stuff. And I don't have a specific favorite line, because a lot of it depends on who I'm going with and where I'm going. I mean, personally, because I've done a lot of cruising, I quite like smaller ships. So if I was just cruising for myself, I would tend to go for a smaller ship, sort of, a 700, 800 passenger ship, very focused on destination, because I'm not looking for a lot of entertainment. I'm very interested in seeing places now and really good enrichment. So I would want, people on board that I know the cruise guy is going to do really good immersion, really good excursions. But if I'm traveling with, my partner, they're into big shows, big busy casino, so I'd go on a bigger ship. I tend not to go unless I'm doing it for the channel, the big resort ships, because I don't have kids, I don't have a family. As such, it's just, it has all stuff that doesn't really appeal to me or talk to me. But I really admire what they do, because
You don't like going down the slides?
Well, actually, I do. I like going on things on water slides, but I don't want to do it with 6,000 other people around and kind of the noise and the buzz. It's not my thing, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Traditionally, food has been such a main attraction on cruises. Let's talk about that. When I've been on a cruise, the food sometimes is like overwhelming.
Yes. I mean, the quality and the range of food varies dramatically, obviously based on which cruise line you're on and what budget you've got and stuff. But I mean, the good thing about cruising is no matter which category you go on, is your food is all included. I mean, a lot of them will have specialty dining and you can do other dining options, but you're going to have at least 3 meals a day, if not more meals a day. But generally speaking, the food is good when you consider particularly, the amount of people that they have to cater for in some of these ships, these big ships, and the amount of meals they're doing. But I always think, generally speaking, cruise food is actually pretty good. And you can have some of the best dining ever. If you go on Cunard Queen's Grill, or you're on something like a Regent or a Crystal, I mean, the food is amazing. Also, what the cruise lines have done partly to raise more money, I guess, or earn more money, is especially dining has become quite a big part of cruising now. So obviously, have you included stuff in the main dining room, the buffet, and some casual dining, burgers and that sort of stuff. Now you can also go on a cruise and be quite experimental, because they might have kind of Asian fusion or Mexican, Italian, that kind of stuff. So you can also experiment quite a bit as well, which I quite like.
Talking about dining now, when I go on a cruise, I think to myself, isn't the food all the same? Because when the specialty dining and the regular dining hall. You can get a steak in both places.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. That's why I tend to feel that, you know, probably the weakest offer across it is most cruise lines have a steakhouse, but a steakhouse is kind of a steakhouse in reality. And you're right, if you're going on a Crystal, you're probably going to have a better quality steak than you are maybe on Norwegian or whatever. But that's why I find the more unusual specialities, which you don't get in the main dining room. I mean, also, though, a lot of cruise lines have started to charge extra in the main dining room now for things like steak. So you can get it, but you're paying often for it as well now.
I'm going to switch topics and talk about there are people who opt to live on cruise ships and continuously travel the world. What types of people tend to do this? And is this more economical than retiring on land?
Yeah, I mean, I've actually made a couple of videos out of it because there's quite a lot of myths around this whole area. There's actually very few people that live full time on cruise ships. And those that do raise a lot of issues around it. So there's kind of a couple of camps. There's one where you can buy you can basically buy a cabin, and then you can live on it as it's your apartment. So there's a couple of, like, the World is the most famous one. There's Willoughby Residences. There's a few more. Keep talking about launching, but kind of never come to anything. Those people tend to have a lot of money and don't necessarily spend all year round on it because they dip in and out of the cruise. But there are then people who will jump around between cruise ships. So they actually don't stay on one cruise ship, they jump around. And what they say in the end is it becomes quite challenging because you're constantly changing cabins, moving cabins, trying to figure out, your next move and how you're going to balance the budget. A lot of people actually do it, interesting enough, on casino deals. So they play the casino quite a lot, which then unlocks a more affordable way of doing it. Not that many people in reality retire on large cruise ships, partly because the cruise lines don't want you to, because the cruise lines aren't set up for people living full time on the ships. They're designed for, 1 week, 2 week, 3 week cruises, and they don't want their crew to start getting caught up in being seen as carers in a way and caring after people. So I have been on ships before where they have been kind of managing people off, if you like, who are aging and spending too long, extended periods of time, and becoming too demanding. So cruise lines don't, except for those ones that sell cabins, don't really want people to do that. So there are people who will kind of hop around, but you always have to have a home base for taxes, for medical, because the medical center on board will not do day-to-day care. So if you've got prescriptions or an ongoing medical thing, you have to go home every now and again to get your prescriptions done, your checkups done, that kind of stuff. So it's also not massively practical. And then, of course, insurance is a massive challenge if you're traveling. So there's a lot of hype about it, but when you actually look at it,
it becomes harder. Yes.
Exactly. And people will tend to do it. I know there's friends of mine who've done it for a year. They said, right, they're going to for a year, and they hop around. But in reality, what they do is they'll come home for a couple of weeks, particularly at peak times. They'll go and try the ships. They try to balance budget and stuff. Yeah.
Is there a cruise that you want to go on that you haven't done? Is there something coming up that you're like, I have to do this? This is on my bucket list?
Yeah. I mean, I always sort of joke is I have a list when I started this thing, and the list gets longer. It never gets shorter. I mean, I'm fortunate because of what I do in the channel. I've done a lot of what I want to do overall, but I haven't spent a lot of time cruising around Africa, which I'd like to do much more of. And one thing that I do have coming up, which will actually be my fourth time back to Antarctica, but it's actually going out of New Zealand right down to the Ross Ice Shelf. Only 2,000 people a year are allowed to go down there. So it's very tightly regulated. There's not many options. And it's a very unique part of the world because you can also
Why are only 2,000 people allowed down there?
Partly because it's so remote, and it's kind of a protected area, and there are very historic sites down there. For example, there's a whole series of huts which Scott had, Amundsen, and various different explorers had down there, which are, because of the nature of the place, are kind of preserved, but they have everything in because the people kind of died or deserted them when they left. So it's a very remote part of the world, even more harder than the northern part of Antarctica. It's even more risky in terms of going there, just in terms of if you have a medical issue or something, it's days and days and days to get out of there. Whereas if you're in the Antarctic Peninsula, it's maybe a day or two in reality to get back across Drake Passage if in medical emergency. So it's more that it's just very remote. So it tends to be more science-based people with very few kind of more recreational expedition stuff going
Do
down
you have
there.
any fear? It sounds interesting, but then as you describe it to me, I'm like, no, not interested.
No, I think it's because I've because I've done other Antarctic trips and I've done some other expedition stuff, like right up into Greenland and Bering Sea and stuff. And so I've kind of sort of know how it works and how it operates. So yeah, I probably shouldn't talk about. Oh, I'll probably scare myself out of it. But yeah, I mean, I'm not anxious, but I'm kind of like, yeah, I'm aware it is quite a challenge. It is quite not challenging, but there is an element of risk to it. Yeah.
Talking about fear, there's a lot of unstable areas in the world. Is there a place that you wouldn't go, or you would tell people not to go on a cruise?
I mean, it's interesting because when I plan my cruising very far ahead, and I always tend to exclude anywhere that I feel is an area of potential risk. So, I had never included the Middle East, Suez Canal for quite a few years now, and I hadn't booked anything ahead because to me that area was always, it looked unstable with everything kind of going on. So I'd always been advising people, because cruise lines started to open up with Middle East cruises, like 6 ships got stuck in the Gulf, when the whole Iran war kind of erupted and happened. They managed to actually get out briefly on that Saturday. It was open. So I tend to avoid anywhere that I think is risky, but also I will always look very carefully at the government travel advice. So, for example, I've just got back from a 31-night thing around South America. In one of the ports in Ecuador, the UK government advice was against travel there. So I didn't get off the ship there. A lot of people did, but it's okay, I'm not going to get off the ship there. So I sort of try and keep on top of that. In terms of where to avoid to me at the moment, the main area obviously is that whole Middle East area, which you can't go. Also, I haven't booked, I would love to go through the Suez Canal, but also with the whole Houthis and stuff so even, friends of mine were booked for this year. They booked world cruises, which required going through the Suez Canal. My point is like, it'll never happen. You're going to end up being redirected because it's just so unstable until everything's kind of clear. And what's happened is they ended up heading off their world cruise. The ship got into Asia and then had to come all the way back. It's coming all the way back the way it came because they can't get through, even before the kind of Iran Strait of Hormuz thing happened. So you just got to kind of sort of think ahead. I mean, it's hard to predict because things sort of erupt all over the place that we hadn't expected.
Are cruises easier to travel on? Like there's less entry requirements mandated on cruises than at airports, or is it the same?
It's largely the same. There's very few exceptions. And this is where actually a lot of cruise passengers trip up and sometimes get refused boarding because they haven't got the right documentation. There's a very few differences. For example, the main difference that I can think of offhand is if you go into Canada as a non-Canadian, out of, say, Europe, like I do, if I fly into Canada, I have to get the Canadian, ESTA equivalent, like if I'm going to the US. If you're coming on a cruise, you don't need it. There's one or two places like that where there's a few little things where if you fly in, you need it. If you don't, I always get it just to be sure. But generally speaking, it's the same. The advantage you have, though, is like on this trip, for example, that we just did, we were in and out of different countries, Argentina, Chile, Peru, etc. And in very few places, we had to do face-to-face customs and immigration. The ship can handle it sometime. The ship can handle it. So literally, we had to do, I think we did a face-to-face coming into the US at the end. And we did one face-to-face. Yeah, I can't remember what it was now. But, I've been on multiple country stuff. Whereas obviously if you're in and out of airports, you're doing it every, if you were flying between Chile, Argentina, you'd be going through it every time. The ship handles it. So they'll take your passport and it gets processed. So that's easy. But you still normally need the same documentation. So if you need a visa, you need a visa. If you need an ESTA, you need an ESTA. So, for example, like when the UK first introduced their equivalent of the ESTA, a lot of people coming in out of particularly out of the US and Canada hadn't realized that, and they were trying to board cruises that were either transatlantics, and they were being refused boarding because they didn't have it. Whereas I guess they would have the same as if they got to the airport and they hadn't had it, they would have been not allowed on the flight. So it's generally the same.
We talked a little bit about this, but what are the differences between luxury cruise lines and the more mainstream?
So there's a couple. I mean, the most obvious one is really kind of size of ship. So that's kind of an obvious one, literally staring in the face. So the size of ship is dramatically different. The second difference is the amount of kind of inclusions. So obviously what the big mass resort ships do is they try to have a low entry price and then try and basically upsell or have lots of add-ons. Whereas on the luxury side, you'll have a higher fare and more included. But it differs a little bit sometimes by line and what is included. So some, on the one extreme, if you've got Regent, for example, they will include even your excursions, drinks, gratuities, Wi-Fi, laundry, all that sort of stuff will all be included. Whereas all of those would be extras if you go on a resort line or even a mainstream line, a premium line like Celebrity. So that's one of the big key things is differences, is inclusions and exclusions and add-ons. And then the other thing, which is also ship related, is you generally find on the luxury lines is they will, at a minimum, all will be balconies. So you won't be able to get an inside cabin or an ocean view cabin. They'll all be balcony cabins. Whereas if you go on the resort lines or the premium lines, you can actually go from everything from an inside cabin, pretty affordable, through to a suite. Whereas as you go into more luxury, that doesn't become an option. And then obviously just the amount of entertainment and choice. So on those big lines, you'll find there's 4 or 5 or 6 things going on every hour. On those smaller ships, luxury, you'll have one thing going on. So it'll be trivia. Or the next hour there'll be a talk. The next hour will be whatever. Whereas if you're on Norwegian or Princess, there'll be...
Well, they try to keep you busy.
Yeah, exactly. So you
They
need
try to keep busy all day long so that you don't have any time for yourself to think.
Yeah, exactly. If you want to be entertained all the time, you'd find that wouldn't happen on a luxury ship because there is not as much choice. Yeah.
How does AI play into the future of travel?
It's interesting because I was actually in discussion with some people about this today. I'm not 100% sure. That I think it's probably going to have more in the back office and the other, all that stuff behind the scenes, as you would, because in reality, AI is not going to replace people necessarily serving your drink or waiting your table or making cleaning your cabin and stuff. So I think a lot of that AI might make it more efficient, but I think a lot of it's going to be in the systems and making the whole booking process more efficient, and presumably also perhaps helping the crew be a little bit more proactive. Some cruise lines have introduced technology like Princess have the medallion, which sort of does capture more data about you, and the crew then kind of know your name and stuff. I suspect AI will help a little bit more in the systems and presumably help a lot with cost, because obviously they have some systems at the moment, but one of the ways to drive down cost is obviously to be much more efficient in routing and how much fuel you're using and speed and all that sort of stuff. But also food waste is a big thing the cruise lines are constantly trying to tackle. I suspect AI will become much better at helping them predict menus and food and quantities and ordering and all that sort of stuff. I think that's where the big difference is going to be.
Will also work for weather. It's probably going to be really good at weather patterns and ocean patterns.
All those systems exist, but they'll be supercharged, I guess, by AI. For sure, yeah.
And aside from cruises, what are your favorite travel destinations and what tips can you share with us?
So probably my favorite land-based travel destination is Australia. I really like going to Australia. And I actually think Australia is much better done as land-based than a cruise in reality, because, first of all, everything's really far apart, but each kind of part of Australia is very different and stuff. So for me, Australia is the favorite, but I find it's similar to cruising in many ways. The way I approach land-based is I book way in advance, because still, if you're going long haul, flights are always cheapest the furthest away you book. And it also, I try and play around a lot with air miles. So that's why I also book far in advance. So particularly with land-based, often if you're going long haul, the flights are often a massive slug of the cost. So I find, to get good air mile routings long haul, you need to be when they first open, 350 days kind of ahead. So for a lot of the land-based stuff is when I play around with air miles. So that's kind of the same thing as planning far in advance. And again, a little bit to what we were talking earlier is thinking a little bit about what is the travel kind of advice around that.
Do you get insurance then always?
Yeah. So I get an annual travel policy. Yeah. Yeah. Which is much easier, I think, to get in the UK than certainly in other parts of the world. I know with a lot of people I know in the US and Canada, they find it more difficult to get annual policies. In the UK, it's more usual. Yeah.
When you're looking for hotels, do you prefer upscale chains or would you say a boutique type?
I sort of play the loyalty game a bit. So I will almost always stay at an intercontinental group hotel. So obviously that's everything from Holiday Inn through to kind of intercontinental and stuff. And I will always, whenever I'm going somewhere, that's my starting point. And the reason for that is they have a really good loyalty program. And also they have an ambassador level, which actually you pay to become ambassador. But what that does is it guarantees an upgrade always. So that's quite useful. So you can book a lower, a room, and you're probably going to get a better room. So I can book one without say a sea view or a great view, and normally you'll be upgraded to do that. But also really important is can get, if you stay in an intercontinental hotel within the group, is you get a guaranteed 4:00 checkout. And because I'm often traveling long, what I find that's fantastic is if you've got a flight at 7:00 at night, you're not having to check out your room at 11:00 in the morning or at 12:00. You can do it right through. So actually, I was often booking an extra night that I wasn't staying to have that extra time and whatever. And that's kind of feel like it's paid for itself as a perk, if you like. So that's why I'll normally stay within the intercontinental group. Yeah.
Yeah. And we talked a little bit about this before about kids travel. Is there luxury travel with kids?
I mean, it's interesting because if you go on some of the luxury lines with kids, the passengers will not be very happy. They'll kind of give you dirty looks, and it's not great for the kids because there's not a lot of kids on. So I've been on some, like we did one at Christmas, for example, which was on Oceania, which is kind of a small ship luxury. It was a 19-night cruise, and the kids were really bored because there was no entertainment for them, the food wasn't for them, and there's no other kids. There was like a boy, and it was a brother and sister. There's another girl, and they're all different age. So what's interesting is the MSC Cruises is owned by the Aponte family, so it's a privately held company, and they are very into family. So they have launched Explorer Journeys a couple of years back, and that's an ultra luxury line, and it's very family friendly. So they have kids clubs on board. Their first two ships only had one kids club. Their new ships, which are rolling out now, have two kids clubs, so they can take younger kids and older kids. They have a kids program all the time. If you want to travel luxury and have the budget, Explorer Journeys is a great option because also there's going to be other kids for the kids to meet and play with, and a proper program for them.
And as we wrap up, is there anything that I have not asked you that I should have asked you?
That's a good question. No, I don't think so. I think you asked probably that question, which is like about people not liking cruises. And my theory is everybody will like a cruise if they get on the right cruise line. The anecdote I always tell is it took me 20 years to get my sister-in-law to go on a cruise. And then I got her on a cruise on a line, which I'm not a big fan of, but I knew she would love. And she's now done, that was like 2 years ago, and she's now done 10 cruises. She's completely hooked. And it's like, I can't believe I took so long to get on. It's because she had all that stereotyping stuff in her mind, but the right cruise line that I knew she would love, and she was off.
Gary Bembridge, thank you so much for joining me today. Tips for Travelers. It's on YouTube, and it's one of the largest cruise-focused content platforms, so you can go check that out. As always, let me know what you think. Put your thoughts in the comments. And until next time, everyone, be safe.